Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Adrian and today we are doing a book review. It's the first time I've done one in a little while, and this is a book for which I have very conflicted opinions and very conflicted feelings about. So let's jump into it. This is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. This is my first Christopher Paolini book. I have not read any of the Eragon series at all. However, this is my first foray into Christopher Paolini. It is a sci-fi space opera. It's his first published attempt at science fiction and has been a long time coming from the Eragon series that he wrote many years ago. Now, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is like I said, it's a space opera. Essentially, we are following one single point of view. That is Kira Navarez. She is a xenobiologist and she is essentially scouting out different planets with her company, trying to work out if there is any profit to be had out of new planets they are discovering. And early on, she discovers a alien artifact which bonds with her. And that essentially attaches itself to her and creates a link with her. So this story is essentially us following Kira as she learns to control and work with this alien artifact. It is sort of not quite a parasite, but it's got that kind of feel. There's definitely a symbiotic relationship going on between her and this alien artifact. She calls it the Xeno often. I'm not going to tell you the other names for it because there's maybe some possible spoilers there. But yeah, she does learn to work with this, and it is essentially like an alien skin suit almost, except it's one that she can't take off. It is permanently on her, attached to her body, and she cannot take it off as she has now formed this bond with it. Now this book is, for a single point of view book, is huge. So I listened to this one on audiobook and it was 32 hours, which for a single POV story is pretty insane. Often the big fantasy and sci-fi epics we get that are huge and 800 to 1,000 pages, they normally are multiple POV. You don't often see single POV books that have this kind of chunky size to them. They do exist, but they're not super common. So that in and of itself is an interesting take that Christopher Paolini has done here, to follow Kira exclusively as we go through what is happening with her. And as such, as you would expect, it's really a character study in lots of ways. It is about dealing with Kira and her feelings and how she's dealing with this Xeno, understanding what is her, what is the Xeno, how are they interacting, how does her individuality and identity hold together while also having this external influence upon it. So it is an interesting setup, and definitely by sort of the third of the way into the book, I was like, I really liked the setup, I liked the premise, and I had really high hopes going forward. And actually this is where there are some really positive things for this book, are the premise. So it is a vast scope. It starts relatively large in scope and it just gets bigger and bigger. It becomes an epic, definitely a sci-fi epic in the sense of its scale and its scope, and the ramifications of what is going on is just absolutely ginormous. So that's really interesting that he has managed to give us this kind of scope that is just huge and overwhelming in the scale and the stakes that we get in this book. I do think as well that the sci-fi elements we get, whether that be the other alien species that we meet later on, whether that be the artifact itself and sort of its origins, I think that's all very interesting. So I think there's a very good premise here in terms of the scope and the interesting sci-fi elements. I think the skin suit itself is an interesting artifact, and we see how that relates to Kira as she develops with this relationship with it. So I think that's really interesting. And particularly for me on audiobook, I will say that the narration by Jennifer Hale is brilliant. Very good narration. I've not listened to any other books by her, but she is well known in the game sphere. She voiced the female Commander Shepard from Mass Effect, amongst many other things. So you will undoubtedly, if you're into video games at all, you will probably recognize her voice. But she does an incredibly good job of voicing Kira, and definitely sort of as a single POV story, It works perfectly that she is just the voice of Kira for me now. So there are some of the really good things about this book. However, as I said at the start, I am very conflicted about this book. And that's partly because I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed this book. I'm just going to put it out there. I thought it was fun. I thought it was relatively interesting. It kept me entertained. It kept me engaged. And I thought it was fun. I just had fun listening to it, reading it. I thought it was good and interesting. However, there are many, many issues with it. And I don't want to overlook these. And this is where it becomes difficult, because my enjoyment here is possibly uncoupled a little bit from actually how good the book is. So there are many things in this list of problems I have with it that maybe didn't bother me as much, but for some people are going to be absolute deal breakers just on their own, let alone all the other issues I have. So take my enjoyment with a grain of salt. I understand there are a lot of issues with this book, and there's a reason that Goodreads does not rate it particularly highly, and why when I've seen people reviewing this or talking about it, they've said it's been a struggle to get through, and they found it very difficult to keep going with. And I absolutely understand that. So one of the big problems I've seen cited in other reviews, or when people have been talking about it in wrap-ups or whatever, is that there are definitely some men writing women issues here. I don't think Paolini absolutely nails the thought process that Kira would probably be having as a woman in a lot of these situations. Now, obviously, I personally am not in an amazingly good position to comment on that, as I am not a woman. However, the impression I've got from a lot of people who have talked about this previously is that, yeah, this is an issue. And it did feel, for me, there was at least two or probably three moments that I felt quite cringy in terms of how Paolini dealt with Kira and how she would think through things. Now, that might be a character choice on his part for how she is personally, but it didn't seem to ring particularly true for me in terms of, is that really what she'd be worried about right now? Is that really what she'd be thinking about right now? It didn't really hit home properly, and that is definitely something that I've seen a lot of other people comment on, so I don't think it's just me. I do think there are definite moments where, particularly when we're talking about her physical relationships with men, when we're talking about issues about her own body, it didn't ring true to me, and I don't think that's just a me problem. I think that is generally other people have picked up on that as an issue as well. Now, if that's going to be a big problem for you, if you really are going to struggle with that, this probably isn't going to be a book for you, even though it's only, for me, there's only about 3 places that it was really obviously awkward. But I'm sure if you're really sensitive to those issues, you're probably going to spot them more and more, and it might become quite a reason you really don't want to continue the book, and I would understand that completely. Another issue I found was that the second half of this book seems to develop more issues than the first. I quite liked where we were going in the first half, and then about halfway through we suddenly started getting these huge info dumps. Like, we'd been slowly learning about the world, we'd been sort of uncovering what was going on, and Paolini was doing a good job of giving us little tidbits of information that we could work with and we could start to understand the world. And then about halfway through we got about 3 massive info dumps, all in the space of about 6 chapters. And it was just, it felt rather gratuitous info dumps. I don't mind info dumps. I really don't. Like, I know people hate them. People really like, oh, they're just lazy, and yeah, they don't like them and they're boring. But for me, sometimes I understand their necessity, and I actually don't have a huge issue with info dumps. I actually think they're a relatively okay use of page time if they convey quickly and easily what we need to know to understand the context of the story. Here, however, we didn't get those info dumps at the beginning. It wasn't like setting the world up for us and helping us understand where we were. We knew that. We knew where we were in the world. We discovered those things more naturally, and he'd done that really well. But then the story sort of pivoted, and then we got these huge info dumps to help inform us about where we were pivoting to, and it just felt clunky. It felt really, really clunky, and especially if you're someone who hates info dumps, you're going to think you're clear. You're going to get through the first half and you're going to think, yeah, fine, no massive info dumps, that was good, I'm learning the world slowly, and then bang, you're going to get them. You're going to get these 2 or 3 huge info dumps out of nowhere, and it's just, it feels like the characters who are telling us about these things are purely telling us about them for our benefit as the reader. It does really feel like that, or it did to me anyway. And that, again, is going to be a massive issue for some people. I would say personally they were the two biggest issues with the writing in this book. They were the two things that I think most people would struggle with, that it's clear people don't like when these are problems. However, there were a few other issues I don't particularly love about this book on reflection. And this was even as I was coming to the climax of the story, I was thinking about how I didn't necessarily love the way it had been structured and the way that Paolini's gone about telling this story, considering that it is a 900-page book. So yeah, some of those things are, I think the plot meanders. It meanders with minimal focus. It's not streamlined at all. Often it just feels like we're being carried along by the winds of fate. Like we're just going wherever we're going and we're doing whatever's happening. And it didn't feel like it had much focus to the narrative, to the plot. Now, in lots of ways, I don't think this is meant to be a plot-heavy book. I think this is meant to be a character-heavy book. We're trying to understand Kira and her development as she grows with this Xeno. And I know it's not meant to be a plot-heavy book. However, I don't think that the character work we got was good enough to absolve this book of its issues with the meandering plot. And as such, I think that actually really hinders this story, because the character was interesting. The character work could have been brilliant, but it was good, okay, decent. But the plot just felt meandering. And along with that, I think it really struggled from having a single point of view throughout the entire book. By the end, we were dealing with sort of universe-defining events. Yeah, like I said, the stakes get big. The stakes get really, really big. We're dealing with universe-defining events, and we're following one woman in one place, who is a huge part of what's going on. But we were really missing so many other things. There was so much going on in the background that we just didn't get to see, that I think would have been far, far more interesting in terms of the plot. And like I said, I don't think this is meant to be a plot-heavy book. I think this is meant to be a character-heavy book, and that's why we're following Kira. But I would have really liked more time spent developing this plot, seeing what other characters in other areas are doing during this massive universe-defining event. And again, coming back to the plot, there were a bunch of roadblocks in this, and they weren't interesting roadblocks. Like, we couldn't go somewhere, we couldn't do something, and then it quickly gets resolved and it's not a problem anymore. And these are things that get introduced and resolved in a chapter or two, and they don't seem to have any overarching necessity to the plot. It doesn't help our characters develop in such a way that informs what happens at the end. It doesn't help them become stronger or more nuanced or understand a lot more. It just kind of feels like they're things that happen and then we get through them, just for this sort of artificial sense of drama and difficulty, when actually I do like the end of this book, but I think the climax we get, our characters were in a position to do that much earlier in the book. I don't think that these roadblocks that got thrown in really helped them develop or change in any meaningful way that impacted the end of this story. And I think that's a real big shame, because we had so many pages, we had so many words, so much time to develop them in such a way that they could change and be different and really impact how they go forward because of their experiences they've had, the challenges they've faced. And it just didn't really feel like that. It just felt like we were having roadblocks for the sake of something interesting happening in the book, but it just got resolved so quickly. There was a roadblock, it got resolved. There was a roadblock, it got resolved. There was a roadblock, it got resolved. It just felt like there were so many mini arcs where it was just a plot thing, but then the character didn't develop. And I think that it was meant to be a character development, a character study is what it felt like. And actually, it felt like it was trying to do more plot things, but they didn't inform the characters as much as I would have liked them to, as well as I needed them to. You see, I've got so many complaints. I've got so many issues with this book, yet I still enjoyed it. I still thought it was fun. I will still read the next book in the Fractalverse when it comes out. I think it's interesting, and I think the concept and the premise carry this book hard. I think the concept and the premise are the things that push you through reading this book and make it worthwhile, because they are good. It is interesting, and the character work is decent. There are side characters who I love. Our main character I understand and I get and I think was developed well, but not well enough for the amount of page time that we have with them. Like if I compare this to one of my favourite series of all time, let's say the Long Price Quartet, in the amount of pages that we have here to Sleep in the Sea of Stars, we have almost all 4 books of the Long Price Quartet would fit into this page time. I don't think quite, but close. Like it's very close. And actually, the character development in that series is so above and beyond the character development we get in this book. It is unbelievable. And that's a multiple point of view series where we follow about 6 or 7 different main characters. So each of those individual characters get so much less page time than we get with Kira here, and get developed so much better than we get Kira here. And maybe that's an unfair comparison, but I just think the amount of time we spent here in a book that to me felt like a character study, not a plot story, we didn't get the character development we deserved or we should have had. And maybe that'll come. Maybe 2 or 3 books into this series, I'm going to be like, whoa, these character arcs are insane and blowing my mind. And that's what happened with stuff like The Wheel of Time for me, where the character development is slow, is really slow and plodding and takes a lot of pages, but the payoff is worth it. So maybe this is too early for me to judge this series, but as an individual first book in this series, it had a lot of issues. What I will say is I still enjoyed it. And for me, that puts it as a 3-star read. This is a book that I enjoyed. I intend to read further books in this series, but I really hope that Paolini cleans up some of these issues. And the 2 big easy ones are learning to write a female character better, basically, and avoiding those massive info dumps that we just didn't need. If we could avoid those 2 things, I think the rest of my issues would be easily just ignored and moved past because I was enjoying the story. But those are the 2 big things I struggled with. So like I said, a 3-star read for me. If those issues I brought up sound like big problems to you as a reader, give it a miss. If those things are probably not going to bother you so much, I would say this is still an enjoyable story. It was still good fun. And if you're into audiobooks, Jennifer Hale absolutely nails the narration on this book. I hope that's been useful. I hope that you have found that interesting and informative. If you like the video, click like, subscribe if you want to see more of my content, and hopefully I will see you guys again soon.